Welcome, everyone, to a conversation with Spencer, the Canadian Highlander council member. I had an opportunity to sit down with Spencer and talk a bit about sort of how he got introduced into the format, some of his experiences working on the council. Spencer, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Spencer Kanaka Sackland. I'm also Death Ray Shaman on the Discord. Been a Magic card player since Slinging Spells in Tempest days, which might date me a bit as an elder millennial. Um, yeah, I believe I'm the longest serving counselor over time, maybe not consecutively, but since the formation of the Highlander Council being voted in, I've been a council member. And yeah, I've been in the format since about the 2010s, 2011s, I believe, is when I first started playing Highlander. It started as a pretty small community in the Victoria region. Um, I played a lot of Legacy, and I previously played Extended, and they used to have Monday night win a duel. So it was pretty appealing back then to do that, and I started playing pretty much every Monday, and yeah, been a part of that community since then.
That's awesome. So you've been playing for a very long time. What sort of decks, or do you have any playstyle preferences that you enjoy? Are there specific decks that are sort of your pet decks? What do you sort of gravitate towards?
I really enjoy, I'd say, creature mid-range or creature combo decks, typically. I used to play a little bit on the SCG circuit. I have a couple top eights there with Elves, what I played, Tez, Elves, and D&T. Um, yeah, I enjoy interactive mid-range creature mirrors, typically. I also enjoy mid-range control and various other archetypes in that. I do like creature combo quite a bit. I enjoy playing decks in a matrix internal that fight against combo decks.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I think all those kind of work within the bodies of the format that is Highlander, which is an internal format.
Yeah, definitely an eternal format. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of start with or dive into a little bit. Did you have a chance to watch the video that I made, specifically the section talking about the pillars of Canadian Highlander from my perspective, sort of from an external, not a part of the council, relatively new to the format, the three pillars that I identified?
Absolutely, yeah. The eternal format, archetype diversity, and the fewest restrictions possible.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on those pillars? I mean, I can sort of reintroduce them, or if you have sort of initial thoughts going into that, or do you sort of agree? Are those pillars that you value as well, or are there sort of different things that you have in mind as pillars for Canadian Highlander?
I wondered if you'd snuck into our previous old forum chats or something like that. Yeah, they're pretty much in alignment with what I'd say that most of the council at various times has described the format as since its inception, which is, that it's a format where you can potentially play anything. It's an eternal format, that it should have a diversity of archetypes available, that anything should be viable. However, that does not mean that everything is like a tier one or like a very strong
Right.
competitive deck, but that anything could theoretically win. That you have a representative of not just archetypes, but also like the color pie as well.
hmm So that's the color pie is an interesting one because that's not one that I'd really thought about. Uh, I think in a large part because I just don't know of a way to possibly make blue not be the perceived best color. Do you think blue is the best color? Like that's my sort of perspective on the format is that and again I don't play a lot of aggro, so I struggle with not putting blue in my decks. But uh, what's your thoughts on the color pie with regards to blue sort of being a demon, as it were?
Oh, like blue and Eternal is always going to be one of the strongest colors,
Yeah.
just at the end of the day. And particularly in our format, blue X mid range decks will always be one of the best decks. So you really have
hmm
like the axis of blue X deck either supporting a mid range strategy or a combo control strategy. And then you have the decks that are trying to attack that strategy, I would say. And sometimes those are blue decks and sometimes they're not. There's a lot of decks in the format that have had a lot of success that are not blue decks, but I'd argue that primarily their entire raison d'etre is to attack a blue deck.
Right. So thinking back over the past, well, I guess almost 13 or 14 years now that you've been a part of the council and sort of been a part of the format, what do you think the sort of like top decks over time? Like, do you think that do you think that where we're at now is relatively indicative of how it's sort of always been with the sort of spread of decks, or do you think that there's some sort of evolution going on that's noteworthy?
There's been a definitely over like a long period of time. There's been a lot of ebb and flow of popular archetypes. I mean, combo has always been a sore point of contention within the format. Obviously, we don't have sideboards. I'd
Hmm.
say within like the recent few years, there's been particularly like elementals are a good example, but there's been a lot of printings of cards that can go in a deck that also serve as an answer that you can just play. Whereas previously, playing like a lot of graveyard hate would be difficult without kind of neutering your deck against, say, like a white weenie or a red deck wins deck. But
Hmm.
then you just lose to Storm or some sort of reanimator. And now almost every deck has 1 to 3 cards, I'd say, that they play that are just a good enough card to play and are also graveyard hate or incidental graveyard hate. So
Right, like Deathrite Shaman.
absolutely, scoos and such like that.
Yeah.
Going before this interview, I went through like some old notes. I think it was 2013 post that I put up. It was just because a deck is doing well doesn't mean necessarily it has to be pointed. There's lots of
Hmm.
necessarily dominating and maybe potentially overpowered strategies we're trying to make less trying to address, but just like a card that's good. And obviously, this is speaking to the time it was written. Green Sun Zenith and Jitte and Force of Will are good cards, but they're not necessarily a
Yeah.
point worthy card. Um,
Sure.
there's been previous iterations of the format where we've banned Flash. Um, it's been I'd say that archetype in particular has been a format boogeyman for many years.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Hard to address, hard to interact with. Recently we went ahead and decided that maybe it was time to see how that archetype actually stacks up against the other AB combo decks.
Hmm.
And then they printed Mr. Samwise, and then it became even more impossible to interact with. So we're like, okay, well,
Yeah.
let's just put this back in the bin of potentially like not as attractive as the other AB combos.
So I'm kind of curious how that changes. So it sounds like you go from taking these combo decks, which are very dominant and very powerful, and then pointing them to the place where they're struggling or they're not there, and then over time, as the threat of the experience of having to deal with them starts to fade, you sort of bring them back. Has that been a long standing philosophy to just slowly like let give them enough rope until they cause problems and then rein them back in, or were there points in time over history where you guys were like, well, just fuck Flash, we're banning it, no interest, and how does that sort of it changed over time?
That's a good question. So over time, I'd say like there's been a desire for the meta to address combo.
Hmm.
Um, the problem with that, I mean, A, we don't have sideboards. B, deck selections and card selections always been a pretty important element of that. So
Hmm.
in our local meta specifically, like we did not allow proxies for a very long time. So combo and certain blue control decks would dominate the local meta quite a bit, but that had a lot to do with card availability. So there's only X amount of players that had access to a large card pool,
Hmm.
and those players would typically play combo decks or combo control decks because they had access to the Lotus or they had access to time bolts and stuff like that. Whereas and Moxen later on, which
Right.
many other players did not. So we still have this, I'd say, like philosophy. Me and several other counselors where like we would like to see the format adjust to dominating archetypes and specific combo through meta choice first, and we do give it time because Magic players, especially with our format, it takes people time to adjust to changing their decks, changing out cards. Now that we allow, obviously collector's edition many years ago, and now just print proxies up to a certain amount in our local meta anyway. It does. We do see people adjust decks and adjust the power and the pointed cards faster, but it still takes people time, sometimes a couple weeks before people are playing new decks. Sometimes people don't show up every week and they don't know that there's, a graveyard interactive strategy that's been dominating our local meta, or like within like, seeing the Canlander Winter Archives, maybe in the Snohomish area, Seattle area, Vancouver area, etc. We're seeing like, oh, there's a Time Vault deck like dominating that area, but like wondering like within their top 8 metas, people addressing this, or are they actually playing a deck that has like access to Collector Roof,
Hmm.
or taking that time. So it's not something that I know that myself and several other countries have acted on very quickly, but we do try and give it the time to do so. I'd say in the last couple of years we've tried to act a bit quicker than maybe previous years. before trying to point an AB combo deck or a dominating combo deck in particular. But we are, I would say, faster to address the dominance or perceived unfairness and advantage of a combo deck than, say, like a blue mid-range deck.
That makes sense. That there's both a sort of a meta that you guys are looking at establishing or managing, and that players are going to adjust and adapt to that meta as well as there being individual decks that you sort of look at targeting and sort of addressing. Would you say that there's sort of a target meta that you guys are looking to sort of have players play within? Recognizing, of course, that there's going to be differences from place to place. Like, are you really looking to see, like, I guess kind of the question that I'm asking is, if we see, a meta, say, well, make up a place. Maybe there's a Boston meta. I don't know. Imagine, in the Boston meta, blue mid-range is dominant. And there's nothing else really being played, and nobody's playing combo, and nobody's playing aggro. Is that cause for concern in the sense that, like, it seems that nobody's really willing to or able to adjust what they're doing in face of these decks because they seem to be dominant there? Are you looking to make sure that some decks and sometimes specific decks, like, if red isn't doing well, we need to target red to make sure that we can find ways to improve its strength by downpointing decks that prey on it. I don't really know what my question is, but I'm trying to, like, ask this sort of big picture thing. Like, are you trying to target decks? Are you trying to target metas? How are you sort of managing those different aspects of it? Because you can point both individual decks up and down, as well as pointing decks in the context of a meta. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think more often we're trying to address cards within a deck that we think will shake the meta. And I can speak for myself, but I know like a couple other councils agree with this, is that it's not so much that the pointing of certain cards will make or break a deck, but it'll incite excitement around playing and brewing within that archetype. So, for example, although I don't think the recent points changes will unseat Jeskai X mid-range from being like a top deck, I think that what it'll do is it'll disincentivize some enfranchised Jeskai players from playing it or adjust their points. And I think it'll also make a lot of people that are maybe chasing wins in whatever local meta or leaderboard to playing a different deck or changing archetypes, or thinking that another blue mid-range deck now has a cooler point spread or an interesting point spread and want to play that. So I think that deck will still be a top deck probably in perpetuity. And I mean, I went through a post for 2016 where I made a joke about how Jeskai was too strong. So it's this is not a new problem. I think it just comes in and out of popularity, and I believe that has a lot to do with the points list.
I think that's a really valuable thing that I hadn't really thought of. But it's not just about managing decks or managing points or managing metas, but also about managing players. That players are a malleable component of the format, that by influencing or impacting the points, you're influencing and impacting the players and how they play.
Oh, absolutely, and I think this also, particularly with the blue mid-range decks and combo decks, comes up a lot. For example, I know we made a lot of changes to artifact decks, be it Time Vault or other archetypes lately, and that wasn't so much because we thought that artifacts were bad and they needed assistance. It was more to incentivize people to actually play within that archetype and explore that archetype. And I think to some degree that was successful. Definitely seen yourself included, a lot of people brewing within the Time Vault archetype, but also a lot of people brewing within mid-range archetype, eggs, paradox. We've seen a big influx in metas across various metas, people brewing and performing with artifacts. And I don't think that has much to do with actually the points decreases making the deck all of a sudden viable. I think it just actually had to do with people being excited to, pick up some artifacts and actually sling them, and then realize after the last 2 years, there's been enough functional reprints or interactive prints of cards that make this deck have some legs, or potentially have some more game and historically bad matchups.
So how do you think that's that sort of ability? So I imagine, right, as Canlander grows, right, assuming that we continue to grow, which I think generally we will because this format is fun, and people are picking it up and sticking with it, do you think that that's going to be something that changes, right? I think that the amount of underexplored or, archetypes that people aren't playing is going to decrease over time as we get more and more people into the format. Do you think that that's something that will need to shift in terms of philosophy as the format grows, or do you think that that's still gonna work pretty well?
Oh no, I believe that'll have to shift, but I think we'll have to reach like such a larger player base that it'll probably take quite a long time for that to happen. And there's still, I think, a lot of people, myself included, that enjoy porting their favorite legacy, vintage, modern deck. In the early years of Highlander, like I spent quite a bit of time trying to port decks that I enjoyed playing in Legacy, and seeing when they become viable. Recently there's been like people that have found out that there's like, there's finally this density of X cards to, make a deck that feels like, Boros Initiative Legacy in Highlander, or feels like, back in the day, like Elves Cradle of became a deck, and those sorts of archetypes.
Oh.
And, D&T, I remember there was a time when like Ben Wheeler and myself were praying for more hate bears from white because we really enjoyed D&T and Legacy. And we're like, oh, it's too bad you can't port this into Highlander. And then eventually, they printed enough cards. We're like, oh, yes, another 2-1 for 1. Finally, a White Weenie's getting there with Thalia, But nowadays, that archetype has a density of cards that you can play many different versions, gets new cards printed for it all the time, and is like quite a successful archetype and a very powerful deck.
So how do you think that sort of current design trends are going to change the density of... do you think there are other specific archetypes that are just a few cards away from being printed, and do you think we're going to see those cards?
I mean, anytime they print a functional reprint of a card, I think that ups the percentage of certain decks for sure. Time Vault's an example, where they've printed, every time they print an artifact for like Paradox or Time Vault, it's always something that kind of needs to be looked at like, ooh, does this like open up another avenue attack? Does this hit right on the CMC? Those archetypes I don't really have a ton of experience with myself, but I do look at. For myself, I'm always looking like, hey, is this a functional reprint of something else? Is this like another Llanowar Elf? That'll allow players to jump the curve. Is this another, like a lot of players are really onto Crypt and Soul Spreads, so is this 2+1 color pip in like red or white going to enable another busted Crypt opening? That sort of thing.
Right. That makes sense. I'm looking personally forward to the world where we someday get enchantment lands, so we can play Serra Sanctum as if it's a Tolarian Academy.
Oh man! Well, one day Ben Wheeler will give me back my Serra Sanctum that he borrowed many years ago, and then maybe that can happen. I think enchantments are probably quite a long time from getting the density required, but there's been various players at times that have endeavored to make that viable.
We just need one enchantment set. That's it. We've gotten so many artifact sets. We just need one proper good enchantment set that's not Theros.
100%, and they all need to be CMC 1 or 2. That's the other issue that Wizards always seems like loath to print a bunch of powerful cards with low CMC for their eternal application.
Yeah. So, what do you think the sort of the perfect format or the perfect Canadian Highlander looks like? Right. If you have you work to sculpt towards, the council works to sculpt towards a target sort of vision for the format. What does the perfect thing look like? What do you want to see show up at every major tournament? And I don't mean like specific decks, but sort of archetypes and the flow. Like if you had to sort of give a broad picture of what a perfect Canadian Highlander top 8 looks like, where the council says, perfect, this is exactly what we're looking for the format to sort of feel like and experience and play. What do you think that sort of goal would look like?
I mean, often whenever we have a new member of the council or a change of the council, we all try and like post our like pointing philosophy so we can all kind of like see where our alignments lie. So it's something I do think about quite a bit. But what would the perfect top 8 look like? I'd say for me that would probably be 1 to 2 blue mid-range decks, and then 1 to 2 either aggro or non-blue mid-range decks, and then a combo control deck, a hard combo deck, and then some sort of graveyard interaction strategy and an artifact strategy. I think that would be a pretty robust amount of archetypes. Obviously, like that's a little more narrowed down, but I think like half mid-range, half or greater mid-range, some portion of control, and then some portion of combo or mixed combo.
A very interesting thing there that you sort of identified that this is one of the things that I think is very interesting about Canadian Highlander and pointings in general. You said an artifact deck, and artifact decks, like some of the best cards in this format, right? Like our the 5-point crypt and the 4-mana Soul Ring are these very, very powerful artifacts. But when you say an artifact deck, you're not necessarily referring to those cards. Even Black Lotus, right? It's a 7-point artifact. But when you say an artifact deck, you're probably referring to a Tolarian Academy deck, not necessarily, a Crypt Soul Ring Lotus type deck.
Yeah, absolutely. I should refer more to like an Academy style deck. Typically, when I think of an artifact deck, I'm thinking of an Academy deck, and within that could be Vault, but probably I'm not necessarily thinking of Vault, but I'm definitely thinking of more of like a Paradox or an Eggs or a BattleBot sort of strategy. But something that it's more of the actual subtype artifact is difficult to interact with, much like the Graveyard. So although there's lots of Graveyard decks, not all of them are Reanimator, for example. But it's more the access at which you're trying to interact with them for me. So if you're trying to interact with like this enchantment deck that'll probably never get off the ground, or the some sort of graveyard interaction or some sort of artifacts, these subtypes that are specific to interact with can be difficult for certain other archetypes, and that's the axis they're attacking them usually on, and also synergy. So
yeah, I think it's really cool that's just one of the ways that we talk about and think about archetypes and formats and the pointings, because you do point for specific like types of decks, which is sort of a nuance that you don't necessarily get when you just do bannings. The deck is either viable or not viable. You can't can't increase the strength and decrease the strength of it when you just ban specific cards that are sort of archetype enabling, versus like an Academy, which is like an entire archetype unto itself that you can increase and decrease in power level by both the cards that it's surrounded with and the card itself, versus like in Legacy where you either can play 4 academies or you play 0 academies, and there's no in between, and the answer is 0. So
for sure. And then how it's some artifact decks, Saga is definitely like the more go-to land for a crop rotation necessarily than Academy, even because you're not looking for a density of mana, you're looking for either a threat or the ability to tutor.
Yeah, Urza Saga is one of the cards I want to get to talking a little bit later on. But before we get to that, I posted a comment in the Discord asking a bunch of folks for sort of questions regarding, some questions that people had to see if they fit sort of the scope of this conversation. And a lot of them had to do with sort of the council, how the council works, sort of how it operates. You want to give us sort of the bird's eye view of how you guys do stuff behind the scenes?
Sure, for sure. I think I'll talk a little bit briefly about the history of the council for those. I think a lot of people joined the format in the last 5 years and maybe don't know that. I think there's several times even within like Discord that I've said something, I'm like, or people have mentioned something, I'm like, oh, we've actually tried that twice. Because just like there's a bit of a long history here. So originally there was kind of a set council of like the kind of grandfathers of the format, then everyone would go and gripe to them, and that they would make a decision based on essentially the input and their own opinion, and that would affect the points list. We've also had various versions of the point list over the last few years. I don't want to get into that, but it's gone from 7 to 10 to 14, then back to 10. Most of the time involving someone who is a PhD math student. Regardless, so then we went to an elected system, and we fluctuated from the elected system up until around COVID times, and then because of a variety of reasons, we decided to go towards a set council. And now currently how the council operates is there's a set number of councilors. There's 5. We had one recent change in councilors, and a person can advocate to be on a council seat if someone else wants to leave their seat. So we had one councilor that had moved and was no longer super active in the format, even though they had been around quite a long time, and they decided that they were going to abdicate their seat, and then someone petitioned, there's a couple people petitioned to be on their seat, and one of them kind of won out. So so how the council functions is we are kind of in a constant communication with each other in a variety of chats and real life. Some of us talk quite a bit, and we discuss cards as they come up. We discuss kind of what we would like this season's pointings to kind of look like in terms of releases. For example, I had a really big push to want to release for 2024 season, partly for TOs. I would like to the next couple of years to be about qualifiers and about people wanting to collect QPs, create excitement around competitive play. So I really wanted to make sure that we started the year off with a big thing of pointings, because we've been discussing some of these pointings for quite a while, but we try and time them usually with like the year-end tournaments for like locally or like the beginning of the year, and then a midway point. when pointing an actual card, we usually all of us kind of have a lengthy discussion, and then we set a time when we'd like to actually start some votes. When we get to voting, we decide like, okay, X people in this group have mentioned this card, so we're going to vote on this. We've also, this many people have mentioned this on the Discord or in life, so let's have a discussion about it. Then we might feel that we don't really have enough opinion on it to vote on it, or we'll say, for example, that a lot of people, we voted on Ancient Tomb 2 sessions ago. There's a bunch of rumblings about Ancient Tomb, but we don't necessarily feel like voting on Ancient Tomb again yet. But maybe we'll have it on our like mental watch list. We used to have a more formal watch list, but honestly, this just was like a salt mine, so we've kind of got away from it. Because people were like, "Oh, why is an X card on the watch list?" Or it just became more of a thing that we had to maintain all the time for the public. So now I just try and tell people, I'm like, "Oh, well, this is the currently cards up for discussion." And I think lately I've tried to be more active on the Discord as well, some other counselors about talking about that.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry,
Oh, good. Sorry, I'm just kind of rambling here.
No, absolutely. It's very interesting to hear and to think about, because of course I'm very new to the format. I've only really been a part of it for about coming up on 6 months now. So I love hearing about the history and learning about how some of the things have sort of come to be. I think the watch list thing, I sort of wanted to chime on a little bit, because that's something that a lot of people in other home managed formats, like looking at EDH as a common comparison, commander, that people are like, well, there should be a watch list, or when cards get mentioned in banned and restricted updates, that those cards are added to sort of an unofficial watch list. And the amount of toxicity that results from people like, oh, you're talking about this card, but not Thassa's Oracle or whatever, right? Whatever it may be. It makes a lot of sense to me, looking at some of the vitriol that comes out of people with regards to the commander's quote unquote watch list, that's something Canadian Highlander councilors are moving away from or trying to avoid, because it ends up being very polarizing.
Absolutely. And previously, when I'd say that, there was the forum, and then later the Facebook group. I used to make myself quite available for people to DM, to talk about cards. And I know their council, Jeremy White, also same thing, and I'm sure others start the way. But just the messages you'd get from people from like Germany or like England or Seattle and stuff, as well as our own like local entitled meta in Victoria. Just people complaining about one card, why is this one other card point, like writing you these like little essays, which I did appreciate, but at a certain point it's like, okay, can we stop talking about like Sensei's Divining Top, or like let's move on, these sorts of things.
Yeah. So that sort of leads us to one of these other questions that people had. Do you envision the council sort of growing or changing over the coming years as we look into the future and as Canadian Highlander continues to grow? It hasn't been a pure Victoria. It started pretty much exclusively in Victoria, and as it's grown bigger and bigger, now we're talking about people in Europe who are playing it, and all over the United States, it's starting to grow in these small little homebrew areas as well. Do you think that the council is going to stick with 5? Does it make sense for there to start being a more worldwide spread so that there's more insight into the different metas? How does the council feel sort of evaluating itself from the perspective of a format that's no longer a local and is starting to become more of a global experience for players?
Yeah, so I mean, I looked at a post. I used to be in contact with someone from the Snohomish area and some other local metas as well, and I'd previously kind of proposed we had like a larger council, and that we gave some seats to other local metas that had like a large following. Mm-hmm. It kind of went by the wayside back then. I can't quite recall why. This would have been around 2016, 2017. And it was difficult to, but this is before obviously the Discord had really taken off, and before Moxfield tracking was available. So it was difficult to look at other local metas. It was difficult to kind of have contact with them. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I'd be interested in doing again. It'd be something that probably the rest of the council would have to be on board with, obviously, and Robin himself. It would be a pretty big change. It's something that I think would be important and would be good for the format. But I think the most important step before then is to establish connections with multiple metas and kind of like who is the dominant TOs of those regions, so we can kind of like have like a discussion of like who's the go-to point for a person in the Vancouver area, who's the go-to person for the point in like this region, sort of thing, and maybe like how like their elections go. Maybe they have an elected seat, or maybe they don't have an elected seat. Obviously, that'll like further create like bias between our local meta and other local metas. So there's a lot of things to address there, but it's definitely something that I'm super interested in. You know, at the bare minimum, there could be like a advocacy group, you know, like Vancouver or Seattle advocacy group or something like that, or council advisory group, and maybe that works its way up to a full seat. There are definitely a lot of options available. It seems like there's a bit of an impetus for that again. So yeah, I'm superly happy to like help drive that home for those people who are interested in doing that. I'd say like for myself, the important thing is that they have like a local healthy meta that at least has like a weekly tournament, because that's really the only way I think that you can have a good grasp on the format, or at least in like paper. I mean, obviously, if you're online grinding a lot, I think that gives you a really good example as well. And that's something that I almost would be interested in doing, is like maybe seeing a seed from that. Previously, we were talking about how the council operates. I just one thing that I thought is important, maybe we discussed the voting, that I forgot to mention, is we actually function on a super majority and simple majority for points changes. So I just want to mention it because I think it's relevant, because a lot of time we're like, oh, someone opposed this, but it still changed, or how come this was
I love the system you guys have.
So we just essentially, for a change that is not a 0 to 1 or a 1 to 0, you just need a simple majority. So 3 of the 2 need to agree. But if it's a massive format change, so that'd be from a 0 to 1 or a 1 to a 0, it requires a 4 to 1 at least. So you pretty much have to get everyone on board to get a 0 onto the list. Right. There's been various iterations of the council over the years where there's kind of been a voting block of 3 that kind of are in alignment in terms of their styles, etc. And there's usually been like I've usually felt like I was on the majority, or sorry, in the the vocal minority, as a typically more on the less blue side of things, and having to fight tooth and nail to get cards like Dig Through Time or Mana Drain pointed back in the day. But hey, you do what you got to do. But for those wondering, sometimes this is why it's really difficult for a card to sit to get lower than 1. Often a card will get, it's pretty easy to get a card lowered to 1, but then sitting at the 1 slot can take quite a long time for it to get off the list, and vice versa. Sometimes it's quite difficult to get a card onto the list.
I think that's one of the things that I've sort of picked up as a sort of a pulse on the community, at least from the people who are more sort of active in the Discord, is that Canadian Highlander moves pretty, like I had a pretty long conversation with one of the other folks on the Discord about sort of the cadence of the council's discussions, of pointings, of the format in general. And I'm somebody who believes that you know, taking the time to be patient, to deliver the correct decision, you know, a month late versus an incorrect decision a month early, is something that I value very, very highly. I think the relatively conservative nature of a commander is generally a good strategy, but at the same time, you know, some of that cadence is really valuable for players who are potentially feeling disenfranchised because they think they are cards they, you know, tools or cards that they want access to that they can't, or things that feel dominant that they're really struggling with. How do you feel sort of about the cadence of the Canadian Highlander Council, and sort of how you guys, you know, make changes, whether that be every 3, every 6, every 1 to 2 months? You know, what's sort of the pace of that? And do you think that it's sort of at a good pace right now? Do you think you guys want to go a little bit faster, a little bit slower? What are your sort of thoughts on the cadence?
We've definitely seemed to move towards a little bit of a faster cadence. I think myself and other councilors really try to push for there to be a more address to cards quicker in a more timely fashion, or at least let's say more organized fashion. You know, obviously in the post-COVID world, everything kind of like had a bit of a change. So there's been more, a bit of a slower return to competitive play. I'd say this last year and a half, last like season and a half, looking forward to 2024 a lot. Seen like an uptick in like more of like a competitive play, like meta exploration, stuff like that. So I think it's more important for us to, as a council, to kind of address cards in a more like timely manner than maybe previously we had. like sitting on Jitte for like 4 or 5 years, sort of as an example. But
Yeah.
I think with this example, like looking at cards like Ancient Tomb, Minsc and Boo, Fourth Eorlingas, etc., as cards that we've kind of like been having like pretty active discussions on very regularly, and B, like coming to actually pointing like forth, which I think opens the box for a lot of other mid-range quotation marks dominant cards. Is something that we're looking to be doing. Sometimes there's the challenge of us all actually getting together in a room. There's certain changes that I think it's easy for us to have the online discussion for, but it's difficult to maybe have like a lengthy top-down discussion on the format via Messenger.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when I'd say 3 of the counselors are very active. One is semi-active, and the other one's a semi-active an active Magic player, but a very like inactive counselor. So it's been pretty difficult to kind of like get us all discussing in the same room together.
So as an external member of the broader community, I would generally feel that having counselors being inactive as being sort of a challenge for the format to try to overcome. I would be somebody that imagines that I want the quote the stewards as it were to be people who are very active in the community, and I know that when I look at, and again, my only real frame of reference for sort of community-based formats, at least given my personal experience, is the EDH and the Commander, rules committee and the Commander advisory group. And one of the things they do is they have people who are not online active at all, right? They're very locally involved in their specific meta or very specific subgroups, but are not broadly active, and so that provides them sort of with a completely different perspective. What are your thoughts on having sort of active versus inactive, and then sort of online engaged versus non-online engaged counselors? Do you think that provides valuable different perspectives, or is that sort of something that becomes more of a challenge?
I think that counselors should be competitively engaged. Like at a minimum, they should be playing either online, specifically Canlander, but I think it also helps to play other formats. I think it's important to have a grasp on like how other formats develop, Eternal formats specifically. I'm obviously thinking of like Legacy here, and to some extent Vintage and even Modern, because sometimes if you just play 100 cards Tilted format, it gives you kind of a warped reality, especially if you don't play sideboards. Sometimes certain players have a bit of an interesting take on combo or like narrow interactive archetypes. So if you don't have access to sideboards, it's really hard to address them. They think that you can just make certain adjustments to your deck and it'll all be hunky dory. But I mean, you can't just shove unplayable cards in your deck. So I think it's important to be able that you have to play competitive archetype or competitive formats. I think you should play one outside of Highlander, and I think they should play Highlander, obviously. And I think that it should be very regular, and I think there should be community engagement. The vehicle to which the community engagement happens, I think, has changed over the years. And I feel that before it used to be quite in the forum or on person or on Facebook. And now I feel like that area is the Discord. I know for myself, I initially quite rejected the Discord, as I felt that, for like 15 years, I'd really engaged with everyone in like 2 other social media platforms and in person, including people from other areas as well. So I was never an active Discord member myself. But in the last, I'd say, 6 months, I've really tried to turn around that, make myself more available to the Discord, talk to people in Discord, and kind of post a little bit of like Q&A sort of things. I know that there's other counselors that are like pretty active on the Discord, or at least follow it pretty regularly. And I think that's important. I think if the consensus that the community is meeting there, then the counselors need to make themselves available to meet where the community is, wherever that may be.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I, initially sort of look in, and, my first introduction to the idea of a counselor was, hearing about Ben Wheeler when he was added to the Commander Advisory Group. And I was like, oh, Ben Wheeler's a member of Canadian Highlander, and I didn't really know anything about any of the other people who are on the council. And it's not on the Canadian Highlander website. You guys don't really have your names and faces front and center quite like Commander does. And I'm sorry to continue drawing back to that. It's just that's where my frame of reference comes from. Whereas like everybody knew who Sheldon Menery was. everybody knew who that was, and that's not necessarily the same with with this format. Do you think that that's something that the council's interested in doing, and in getting names and faces out more publicly and having sort of profiles and stuff like that, or is that not as important to the council?
I think cloud chasing is something that hasn't super been important to most of the counselors over time. I also think that, I mean, majority of not majority, but quite a few members of the council work in education. So,
Sure.
and, some are also more public figures. So, I don't think that there's been a desire or need to spread their name everywhere. And we're known quite well. Every counselor is known quite well locally. So as it spread into more of the online format, obviously someone like Ben, who's actually a recent counselor, has a lot of notoriety online and a big public presence. But some of the other counselors have been around for a long time, like Robin, who's one of the foundations of the format, particularly, is maybe not a spread. His name is not spread as wide,
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's not something that's been driven home, but something that I think part of the reason I've been posting more lately, and obviously doing this interview as well, it's just more to kind of engage with oh, there's these other people on the council that you can interact with, a little bit about our deck design philosophies sort of stuff. There's also Evan and Sasha as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I noticed once you and a few others started chiming in on the Discord a little bit more, because that is one of the ways that I engage a lot with Magic, is that I was like, oh, this is so cool. I remember joining and having my first dialogue with one of the counselors, and I was like, oh, these are people that will just talk to me about my opinions and my thoughts, and that was something that I found very meaningful and very cool. And I think that's something that I think a lot of other people would find value in, that especially if you're not from Victoria, where it's you don't know these people in the way that if you play with them on a week-to-week basis, you would get to know them. But this is the longest conversation you and I have had, and it's very cool, and I appreciate a lot that you're willing to take the time to come and chat and have dialogue about everything from the council to the points and everything in between.
Oh, of course, yeah. No, I'm a person that I worked in education for a long time before my current kind of job, and I have always tried to make myself available to the community to discuss pointings, philosophies, griping, essentially that. I'd say that the gripes are less than they used to be, so that's always a good sign. And I think that speaks a lot to the various council iterations, attempts to steer the format to a good place. And I think it's important to note that I think that the format is in a good place right now, and that's something that I know Rob and Sasha and myself have mentioned several times, is that we do feel the format is in a good place overall. Obviously, there could be dominant archetypes from time to time, and people can still want to whinge, but considering where we've come from and the length of time, I'd say that various archetypes and strategies have been viable. Nothing seems to be completely dominating and making tournaments unviable. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to talk about the most recent points changes.
Let's bring it on.
And everybody, and basically everybody that I've spoken to loved them. This set of point changes, and again, I've only been around for 3 total point changes. Right, I started playing just as Balance and Mind Twist and Library went. I think those were all in the same one. All went to 0. But so I've only been around for a very short period of time, but the community's response to these point changes was just excitement, and even the people who, even the Jeskai players who got their recall pointed up to 8 were like, yeah, fair enough, that's okay, we get it, but it's good, it's still good. So this is a very, very awesome, this points change was very, very exciting for me, and I think a lot of people are really, really happy with it. So I'm glad the council's this, we're in a good place, because everybody's happy. We're stoked to try all these new toys. So do you want to just sort of start at the top and we can chat about each one as we go down, or are there specific cards you want to chat or dive in a little bit more detail on?
No, we can just kind of dive right in. I would say that we have been in kind of discussions on where Moxen sit in the format in relation to the rest of Power 9. I think, as I've mentioned in some of the Q&As for myself, and I know some other councilors kind of basis as well, how Moxen sit versus Recall Time Walk versus AB combo has always been kind of the weird barometer where things sit. And then the one slot has always kind of been for like dominant mid-range cards, like off, like, you know, not necessarily super viable tutors, etc. And then we try and like range everything off that.
Right.
When we've had like different points numbers, there's been like other ways points have been addressed, but I think 10 has been the best one so far. 14 was awful. Anyone that says more than 10, I'm just telling you it was a bad time. And it was very much vibes, which I don't like.
Yeah. So do you think that the sort of standards that we have right now with sort of Moxen at 3 and A plus B combos at 7 plus, is that sort of, does this feel like sort of the gold standard? Is this kind of where things, you know, are planning to sit and intend to sit? You guys mentioned discussing Moxen. Is it discussing Moxen from the perspective of we want it to change but we're not sure how yet, or we're just trying to evaluate and double check to make sure that all is well before we, you know, continue to maneuver within this standard?
I think the desire was to make this large medium change first, see if it has some of the desired effects, and then perhaps look at a more larger change in general to how the entire list is formatted, which would basically move AB combo and Moxen to a different number. So, and then everything else would have to change would be the issue with that, which would be pretty huge format shakeup. Not in terms of actual, I think, deck choices necessarily, but just in terms of like pen and paper, people actually having to like readjust how they like look at points, how they maybe like style their deck, that sort of thing. And that could be exciting, but it's something that would require all of us to probably sit in a room at a Red Robin's over milkshakes for at least a few hours or something. So this is our kind of first attempt at like a big seasonal change that maybe will have this similar effect, which would be to kind of jumpstart the format a little bit and get people excited to brew, get people maybe changing some of their dominant spreads, etc.
So what's the impetus for sort of looking at the standard of, you know, again, the sort of the two ones we've identified here at Moxen at 3 and AB's at 7? What's the concerns that the council is sort of experiencing or feeling that makes you guys sort of reevaluating these standards? Is there specific play patterns, or is it a meta, or just sort of the way that people are looking at points that you guys are trying to change up or shift?
For multicolor non combo decks, just it not being a 3 Mox spread is always something that we're interested in looking at. I think that 3 Moxen or Crypt X fast mana decks are always how fair decks are going to interact with unfair decks, unless they're blue. So for the non-blue decks, you know, you're looking at, is this Moxen spread or fast mana spread either going to enable me to have a busted start a higher percentage of the time, versus like able to like maybe potentially like tutor or like enable an initiative start, and is that going to be fast enough to interact with the non-fair decks and potentially overcome the inherent dominance of blue?
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's, you know, it's difficult because a non-blue mid-range deck that's not necessarily like a mana crypt deck. So, you know, thinking of like Naya here, perhaps like Jund, even though Jund hasn't been necessarily been a well-performing deck for a long time. Thinking of those kind of decks as like, well, they're just going to be a 3 Moxen deck, and there's no real other spread that makes sense for them. And is there any way to address that? And then if so, what's the one-pointed card? And is there a way to make there be like an interesting spread for perhaps like even like a bug or a band shell that isn't just the Jeskai spread and isn't just like a recall spread, perhaps opening up like time walk spreads outside of Seeker Walk, etc.
I think that's something that this point change really did a good job. So Demonic Tutor going from 4 to 3 and Strip Mine going from 3 to 2. A lot of players are looking at bug spreads with both Demonic Tutor and Strip Mine as 5 of the 10 points that they're playing, and ditching a lot of the, you know, they're still playing some amount of the digs and cruises and stuff like that within blue. But, you know, Jund getting Birthing Pod if it wants it, you know, those types of changes are things that I think are starting to shift a little bit or create some incentive for players to play some sort of land strategies. And of course, gifts going down makes land strategies better as well. Was that sort of one of the targets for these points changes? Is that one of the goals of adding these in to try to push off or potentially, you know, make it so that we didn't need to change Moxen because of the shift in these other points?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Demonic Tutor as a card is something that we've often joked about being like, you know, a fair DT. and not trying to like look at a
Yeah.
card objectively as like the fair version of it, because it's often the maximum potential is its unfair version. But the current structure of the points list, like DT Lotus, is something that is not necessarily as good as a breach version of deck. The majority of the
Yeah.
combo-esque players in the council have determined like the breach Lotus decks are the best version of that deck. So really now we're looking at Demonic Tutor being a fetchable tutor for some of the AB decks, and is that as good as like the wider tutor options? Probably not. So then is DT going to mimic kind of what it is in German Lander, which is a bit of the format police, able to like find the silver bullet for a lot of matchups that are, maybe like unfair or attack at an unfair axis. So for example, like graveyards, artifacts, etc.
Hmm. I think
So
also natural order coming down also gives some push towards those. I know you guys mentioned, I think in the points before this one, you guys mentioned we're discussing Tinker. Were you also discussing Tinker potentially coming down to 2? And if so, what was sort of the thought behind both natural order and Tinker, of course, being very similar cards in terms of what they do? What's your sort of take on those two cards and that style of deck, or the type of stuff that people have to speak on with that?
Well, I think I mentioned this in our points discussion amongst ourselves, where I'm like, I think I've cast Natural Order to competitive play more than anyone else in the council. So uh, played a fair amount of elves, but Natural Order, in its essence, I think is always going to be lesser than Tinker in our format, because
Hmm.
obviously at its baseline it can grab attacks off of like one creature, which is like an extremely powerful card. It's going to draw a lot of cards, potentially game winning. Um, but most of the Cradle of X decks rely on a board state that's quite large. Cradle of is an archetype in general that I think is a bit of a bygone era. Um, the invention of like advocates of people playing an excessive amount of red, in addition to like the Fury and Pyrokinesis, etc., and a lot of hard combo has like kind of led to that archetype. I think just it's pretty much it's unable for it to push through. I think the average tournament, and a lot of its like formerly dominant archetype matchups aren't even as good anymore. Plus now you have probably a prevalence of like fighting Jitte again, which will mean that it's pretty difficult. So really that opens up Natural as more of a blue widespread card with maybe like a bug or a band archetype, and maybe that's exciting. I'd also say that the Natural Order spread for the green ramp decks, Cradle X decks, they're not actually affected by this points change, really. I mean, really, their points were just Natural Order and then whatever type of fast mana, but none of which is that great for them.
Right.
Besides Mox Emerald, Crypt and Sol Ring are okay, but only if you're trying to ramp out Planeswalkers, which I don't think is actually like an incredibly powerful thing to be doing in the current meta, for example.
Yeah, that's fair. A card that doesn't play well into Planeswalkers at all is Umezawa Jitte. Uh, that card's gone the last time. Every time that card's been point changed in the past 2 years, it like went from 1 to 2 to 1 to 2 to 1 or something like that. Like this card moves around a lot. Why is this card so hard to get right?
Jitte is a really difficult card to get right, and it's funny because I often look at, it's just it doesn't even have that much prevalence in necessarily like legacy, but is an extremely like board dominant and powerful type. It's a card I don't think could be zero. Maybe there's a world where it is. I know Sash and myself. I mean, I've been trying to get Umezawa's Jitte lowered for quite some time, but recently, Sash and myself hesitated slightly in our discussions, just as Jitte sitting at 2 doesn't feel like a soft ban, but essentially pushes it out of a lot of the mid-range archetypes, which would then make their mirrors being about Jitte, and the board states that kind of creates, which are not necessarily enjoyable, and about this difficult to interact with card. But then since fourth is kind of fulfills a similar slot in this very swingy card in these mid-range creature decks as well, we decided that maybe it's just time to let it go and see what happens. Jit's pointing has often in the past been more about a meta consideration as opposed to the actual individual card power level, and that was perhaps wrong of us to do. It's one of the few cards I think that has sat at its points mostly due to meta consideration as opposed to actual raw power card level in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think that's one of the. It's interesting because I went through and I was evaluating all the different cards on the list, and Umezawa Jitte was one of the cards that kind of poster childed for me an example of this card is pointed not because of what it does for you, but what it does to your opponent's ability to choose decks and to build decks in certain ways because they know they have to deal with the Umezawa Jitte on your opponent's board. And I think that's a framework that a lot of players don't necessarily intuitively default to, right? They think about, well, I get to go land, crypt, tinker. I empirically can understand why that is strong, but you don't necessarily think of how cards that your opponents choose to put in their decks are going to impact the cards that you can put in your decks. And I think some of the reduction in creature strategies because of cards like Fury, even Solitude and stuff. These pitch element, these very very strong cards that people want to be playing in their decks anyways, sort of push some more creature strategy. Push them down and push them away, in subtle and nuanced ways that a lot of people miss. And I think Umezawa Jitte is one of those cards that it makes a lot of sense why it's hard to get right because it does fit into that weird sort of half. It's not necessarily because it's super busted for you to have, but it really makes you have to play around it or play within the context of a meta with it being prevalent that causes concern. And it's another one that is going to be dependent on a meta by meta basis, right? There could be some small in groups where there's 3 Jittes, and so you have to all the decks, all the creature decks are pushed away because there's so many Jittes. And other metas where just nobody plays it, so it doesn't do anything, so nobody cares.
Absolutely, and to some extent, Jitte, similar to Mind Twist, which finally got off the list, but had a lot also do with NPE, like negative player experience, where it was a card that and when we get to it, I'll talk about Minsc and Boo as well, which I feel is also similar. Whereas, like, you would have lost to another card, but that's the card that pigeonholes everyone onto why they lost that game, and it creates a negative player experience surrounding it. So then they have
feels bad.
Feel bad, exactly. I'd argue that Mind Twist is actually a little different, but similarly, these like powerful swingy cards that people cast and then interact with their opponent, and the players feel that they didn't get to play Magic after, which is not a good experience. Even if they lost the game because someone drew like 6 cards and the game went on for another 5 minutes and like 8 turns, they like still feel they had a chance. That's not necessarily the same MPE, but maybe like the power level issue is still there. But whereas some people play these 1 cards and that 1 card ends the game immediately or makes it untenable for the player to activate their game plan, it's not something that we often try to like take as a sole reason for like points changes and whether or not it should be included, etc. But it's definitely something that gets taken into account in the discussions, at least if things are close. So,
I mean, it makes sense. Speaking of player experience, the best 1-card combo in this format going down from 3 to 2. What are your thoughts on Spellseeker? People were ready for Secret Walk to come back and a little bit more of a research, get a little bit more room to work with.
Spellseeker, I've always felt it's been the tail end variation of the Kiki Pod deck. Having played and seen and worked with the people that developed that deck from its inception, that deck is a strong deck, but similarly to like to other creature combo decks, it suffers the same problem with it. It can be interacted with on every axis, and potentially worse than other combo decks, it can be interacted with by removal, counter magic, hand attack, and graveyard. So, as well as
like
as
every
well as
axis, all of them,
and even like the weird ones like various like hate bears out of D&T or any white X deck that just like are on whatever hate bear prevents you from casting multiple, which could be there's multiple cards, but like the 1 spell turn cards that are becoming quite popular.
Archon of Myriads.
Everyone jams in Archon, but now you have people playing Canonist and stuff once in a while as well too. So you're getting hit on every axis. That is a deck I feel had a brief time in the sun where it was quite good. I think that time has passed, much like the rest of other creature combo decks, and I think that it would be nice to see them see a bit more prevalence of being played, and maybe spike the tournament, but I don't see them being like a super dominant meta archetype anymore. But it'd be good if they were played more, and I think it's fine for them to do well. Like I said, they're interacted with on every phase of the game. I think the Spellseeker and Birthing Pod lowering, it'll be interesting to see what the Seeker Walk decks, which color combination they move towards, whether or not the Kiki Pod version or a straight Seeker Walk version becomes dominant. I think both are potentially viable now. And I think that if they start performing well, that's probably a good thing, and then that'll lead to potentially like more combo in the meta or more creature interaction, which is also a good thing. Yeah, I'm not worried about this archetype becoming extremely dominant. I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things evaluating Spellseeker is sort of interesting for me is that Spellseeker in the context of Seeker Walk is somewhat hard pointed, right? Like you're playing Seeker Walk because you're playing Spellseeker and you're playing Time Walk because they're a combo, and people putting Spellseeker is not worth 3 points if you're not putting it in your deck for the combo. It might be worth putting it in your deck for 2 points if it's not being put in the deck for the combo. And I like that the card can get moved from sort of a very hard 3 points to sort of a softer 2 points, where people are now looking at other places where Spellseeker makes sense. Do you want Spellseeker in Flash? I probably not, but do you want Spellseeker in Thoracle? Well, maybe. Now you've got the Wizard Cyclers. And I like to see the ability for these very strong, hard-pointed cards to as the meta evolves, to soften a little bit and be able to be played in more decks, because it opens up more brewing opportunities.
Oh, totally. And that was one of the impetus behind it, was we're like, okay, if we unpeg Spellseeker as an archetype from these 2 points, is that okay? A, and then B, if we lower Spellseeker, does this enable it to be actually like viable in a like go wide blue strategy for points? And I think that can be exciting for people. And as I was speaking about earlier, that's like a lot of what I believe a lot of these, sometimes these minor points adjustments do, is they brew excitement, which is the most important thing. And if someone's excited to play Spellseeker in their blue mid-range deck to go fetch Time Walk, or or Recall, or if they're like going to try and jam it into like a combo deck, or if it's just a value card because they want to play like a Bant Blink deck that doesn't have Time Walk, a lot of like just value spells. Like, those are all exciting things, and those should be viable.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool point change. Another point change that I think is personally very, very cool is 4th Eorlingas to 1. I cannot tell you how much I love spending a point on that card, where I'm like, yeah, no, this feels good. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm gonna put 4th in my deck, and I'm gonna pay a point for it because I can, and it's because it's really good. This card is so good. I think 4th to 1 is a very monumental shift, both in sort of communicating to the community that, like, yes, we're watching these cards, and it was the correct one. It is the most egregious of this new era of cards, where we're talking about the Minsc and Boos or the White Plumes or Urza Sagas. Like, 4th is a ridiculously powerful card, and I love spending a point on it. It makes me feel cool to put the card in my deck, even if it costs me a point to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree that 4th of our like powerful mid-range fair cards that swing games, we all put 4th as our number one, and I believe that most people in the community would agree with it. I think for me, the real big turning point on that card too was when it became the finisher in a lot of combo decks. There's various types of mana ramp strategies, aggro decks, mid-range decks, control decks, combo decks. It's like, okay, it's time. And all of us were pretty unanimous on that card being point worthy. It was just whether or not we were pointing philosophy of like where we want mid-range cards to sit on the list and their 1 point philosophy. There's more of a larger discussion about that right now, which might mean that some cards that went to 0 would go back to 1, and then maybe we'd increase the points of other cards, but that's probably later in the year discussion that we might have, and it may never come to pass. So for now, we've decided that 4th Eorlingas is definitely worthy of point of those cards. Some of the other ones, perhaps, but we wanted to try to have the one that most people would agree on the most, which we think is this one.
Yeah, and then I think the number 2 culprit is Minsc and Boo. I mean, you guys voted on it, didn't change it, but voted on it. Minsc and Boo, very good Magic card.
Yeah, Minsc and Boo is a very good Magic card. I it's definitely on my list of cards to think about a lot. I voted against it this time around, and previously I kind of advocated against pointing for it. It's a card that, much like I was discussing earlier, I think people look at it as the focal point of their ire, where they like an unanswered Minsc and Boo lost them the game. It's in a couple colors that I think are also like they are splashable in a lot of the Jeskai green decks. Obviously, it comes to mind, but a lot of other archetypes that rely on the color combo are not necessarily dominating, and enables them to have a fast clock, which is important. The card can be interacted with. I think that's important to note. It does close out games very fast, but you can interact with it. And I think that there's a variety of other cards also that, if ramped out early or even played on curve, could also end the game. I think that's important to note. Like, this is a card that, like, yeah, there is removal for it. If you play to the board and have removal, you can deal with it. There's lots of games like that. People just think of the games where they're like, oh, when they played a turn 2 Minsc and Boo, and I lost.
And then I died.
Well, it's like, well, yeah, but they played a CMC 4 card that's hard, like, on the board to your nothing, and you didn't have counter magic, but that's fair enough. But also, what was the real culprit here? Was it the Mana Crypt? Was it the Ancient Tomb? Like, what ramped it out? And they're like, oh, well, they had Mox, Ancient Tomb. It's like, well, what's the real problem cards here, guys? So
yeah,
I think that's also important to address, is that I think a lot of the time, like, it's different with fourth because that one is a finisher and plays on all axes of the game with its variable CMC. But with Boo, if someone plays it turn 4, realistically turn 3 in a green X deck, I'd say, outside of maybe Jeskai, but let's say it's played on turn 3 or turn 4, you are probably losing to a lot of cards if you're losing to this card and you have no way to interact with it, no way to play to the board, no removal, no counter magic. Well, what were you doing?
Yeah, what was happening in the context of the game that led to you just dying to the Minsc and Boo?
Like if you're on your Scape Shift deck and you're trying to hit your 7th land drop and like you lose this Minsc and Boo, you probably also might have lost to a Questing Beast. You know, it's maybe jumped the fundamental shift turn down by 1, but there's probably a variable like width and breadth of cards that you might have lost to in that situation. So I'm not saying that I'm always going to be opposed to pointing Minsc and Boo personally. And there's probably a world where this card does end up being a point eventually, but I'd like to see people maybe look at the other cards that are potentially problematic, as well as playing to the board more. And I find that more often than not, the people that lose to Minsc and Boo, at least what I can think of anecdotally, locally, and even like looking at watching matches and other metas too, where people lose to Minsc and Boo, it's either ramped out by fast mana, or they're playing either a combo control or a pure combo deck, and they have very little ways to interact with the board. Most of the mid-range mirrors, although like Minsc and Boo can be like definitely a haymaker card, but if they play to the board, like a lot of time makes the Boo, they have removal, attack, or have a fateful absence, etc. So there is interaction with it for that level. So I think that a lot of the times players that are trying to play a turn 5 combo deck, and then they just have their fundamental turn cut short, and I'm okay with that personally.
Yeah, that's kind of thing. Like, as a combo player, I'm kind of like, yeah, no, I get it. That's fair. I think Minsc and Boo. I think that the decision not to point Minsc and Boo is a really good indicator that the council is still. You guys are still relatively conservative. Like, there was a bunch of points changes here. You added the most important card, but still collectively you were like, okay, we do need to do something. 4th is the correct hit. The second hit, it's on the table. We recognize it's on the table. We're clearly watching for it, but we're not ready to move on it yet because we're making a bunch of changes. Maybe it is fine, and we want people to be able to play with cards they like, and people like playing with Minsc and Boo. They like playing with all the cards, but people like playing with this card. And if we don't have to point it, we don't want to. We will if we have to, but if we don't, we won't. And I really like that part of the philosophy. And even though I personally think that it could have gone either way, I think it's reasonable to point, and it sounds like we're sort of on the same page there, that like in another world it was pointed during this most recent points change. In this world it wasn't, and that's something that is okay, and we're not going to, nobody's on the streets crying out Minsc and Boo's the biggest problem. Like, we got fourth. That's a good start. We're taking our time, we're being patient, we're letting the meta evolve and shift and soften a little bit with these things, and let's see how it rests before we need to make another points change.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to like look at what the fundamental turn is. Right now I think the fundamental turn has kind of split in 2 different directions for people's deck building decisions. Look at the legacy meta right now. Like, Minsc and Boo is not dominating. Some of the green X Mavericky decks don't even play it sometimes because the CMC is too high. Over the years, Highlanders really fluctuated sometimes, and like players have definitely exploited this when the fundamental turn gets super low, and then people can exploit that by playing ramp strategies or combo ramp strategies, or just decks that have a higher fundamental turn and play more powerful cards later in the game. Then there's also players that have the reverse is also true. Sometimes when that happens, people are like, well, if everyone's playing these powerful 4 and 5 drops, I'm going to start playing 6 drops. And then it almost starts resembling they're playing less 1 drops, they're playing less interaction on CMC 1 to 2, even like outside of a blue deck, which is wild to me. And then they're just trying to ramp out these 5 drops. Obviously a lot of the medium decks come to mind here. They often still have a lot of CMC 1 interaction, but they're trying to play on a fast attack clock, high CMC threat, but they're also trying to win on these higher fundamental turns because they have access to these high CMC threats. So people start to play decks that resemble commander decks. They're going to lose to combo. They're also going to lose to a graveyard deck that reanimates a Archon on turn 2.
Yep.
Unless they have like their 1 of swords, etc. So when people start to raise their fundamental turn clocks, they start to like look at a lot of these cards as like, oh well, that card really dominated because they got it out early and it was extremely powerful on that curve of CMC 4 on turn 3. Well, if the fundamental turn becomes like turn 2 to 3, the game was already decided by then. It's like, well, the Minsc and Boo doesn't look very powerful anymore. If the format is resembling a lot of hard combo, very fast combo, or like really low to the ground Moxen fast mana strategies that are trying to get initiative on turn 1, the fundamental turn is really different. Minsc and Boo doesn't look as powerful anymore. So it's really just depends on like how fast your deck is and what the CMC range you're looking at. And generally speaking, and every time I look at Canadian Highlander decks, there's 2 things that are almost always true: not enough lands, and B, they're playing way too high CMC, and it's because people have too many pet cards at CMC 4, or they think of the one time that their CMC 5 card won them the game. They're like, well, I got to play that Titania or that Glorybringer because it's really dominant when I Eldritch Evolution for it or whatever. But they don't think all the times it was stuck in their hand or the game was over on turn 3 because they didn't have another duress or another lightning bolt or another like force spell pierce equivalent or whatever.
Yeah, I think that there's some of the fact that, and I think part of this also is that with Modern Horizons 2, we're ending up with and even just like Lord of the Rings, we're ending up with high end cards that are also like to start free half the time, right? Like the Fury and the other pitch spells, which are both 5 mana bombs that wipe the board and it's a 3/3 double strike, but are also free spells. And cards like Aragorn or Omnath that are just so generically powerful and that just aren't that expensive. Like Glorybringer versus Omnath, one of these cards is a lot stronger than the other.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not saying these cards aren't powerful and like they can't be a powerful part of deck building. I'm just saying that people are slow to react to fundamental turn shifts, and at times when the fundamental turn is lower and people are interacting lower CMCs, it can be a good idea that can build a deck that can go a bit bigger. But sometimes if everyone's going bigger and trying to go over the top of them like an arms race, then moving the fundamental turn lower is definitely advantageous and can affect like the power of cards. Omnath, is a pretty very powerful deck when 2 mid-range blue decks are going off against each other, or mid-range decks in general. But it's a laughable card when someone's trying to reanimate something on turn 2, or when they're trying to like flick back recall. So take that for what it is. Something that you mentioned just there, which pinged something I thought I should talk about too, was that Modern Horizons 2 shook the format up quite a bit, and it's definitely one of the sets that we think like added so many cards to the format. Some that did impact our 2024 pointings was holding off for Modern Horizons 3. We didn't want some of our other changes that we had thought about. We decided that we would rather wait and see a little bit for potential cards for Modern Horizons 3 that'll either ramp up, change, or be overtly powerful. So that is just something that, that's one of the few times we've tried to future-proof ourselves a little bit, just based on how powerful Modern Horizons 2 was for the format and how much it changed archetypes. And then also how much, like, basically that information made us adjust how we want to go forth because of Modern Horizons 3 coming out this year.
So that makes me think about one of the cards that I wanted to talk about was White Plume Adventurer, which didn't get pointed during the last points change, wasn't voted on this points change, and sort of from my perspective is not really a card under discussion anymore to get pointed. Is that evaluation accurate, or is that still a card you guys are talking about?
WPA gets brought up, as well as Ancient Tomb, probably in every discussion session. I've been an advocate in the past for Ancient Tomb to be a point. The points list was moving away from 1-pointers at that time, so we've decided kind of against it, and it was voted down in a previous vote. I often look at Ancient Tomb as well as some of the other 2-mana ones as that the mana ramp strategies are what people actually like lose to, as opposed to the like Minsc and Boo, for example.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, please.
No, go ahead.
I think that when you were discussing sort of the critical turn, that's something that I hadn't considered or added to my framework. Is that, you know, when you think about the critical turn, Ancient Tomb accelerates the critical turn in many decks by 1, because it is essentially fast mana. And, you know, you think about Mana Vault, which is 3 mana for 1. Ancient Tomb is 2 mana for 0. And certainly the life loss is not inconsequential, especially on a couple different turns, but the speed increase feels certainly like it could be an entire point worth of additional speed, because it changes that critical turn of your 3s and 4s and 5 drops by an entire turn, and especially when combined with Moxen, creates some pretty explosive starts.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, obviously a lot of the green X decks and the white decks really rely on these fast mana turns to be able to keep up in a eternal format, particularly if they're not playing blue or they're comboing. So, you know, for myself, I think that WPA will always have a bit of a target on its back. It's probably less likely to be targeted by me than, like, let's say a card like Minsc and Boo. Sure. I also think that Ancient Tomb and WPA are part of the D&T spread, which it's difficult to address. Obviously, both very seen outside in other archetypes, other medium archetypes, but these cards are often essential for these kind of like fair Maverick style decks to attack the combo and other blue non-midrange decks. The problem is, like, obviously, like, multicolor midrange decks have difficulty playing the colorless lands. Their pip count's very high. So one way that the duo color decks can capitalize on that is by playing crypt style decks, and also D&T. You know, I'm thinking of D&T, Boros, and Gruul here as being decks that have performed well. Specifically, obviously, D&T medium red and red green. They capitalize on this by playing the Ancient Tombs, the Crypts, the Sol Rings, the City of Traders, just access to these like curve jumping cards. And D&T particularly really relies on this to get out their hate bears early and play a mana denial strategy after that. So if we point these cards, that. No, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, please go ahead.
So if we address these cards, this is for myself anyway, but I'm fairly certain Sasha agrees with me. If we address these cards in this way, then one of the formats, essentially police, which is the fair police, which is D&T, certainly like lowers power level, and that'd be one of the rare times where I think the pointings of these cards would actually shift a archetype away from being a top contender to being less viable. And I think if we pointed those cards, it would definitely really hurt that archetype, which I feel like we are always trying to put into the tier 1.5 to be able to combat the other archetypes, and is also an accessible archetype, which I think is important for players too. Looking to get into the format and not play proxies, looking at D&T humans is like a way that, hey, I can play this format with these eternal cards. Here's a deck that is, obviously this is an extremely expensive format to get into, but here's this archetype that's viable, powerful, fun, plays good games of Magic, has game against everyone, and is like, attainable in terms of card pool. And I think that's really important for the format. You can't just have mono red in every format be like the cheap deck. And that's not to say that D&T is like necessarily
deck
cheap.
That exists.
Oh, totally. And D&T is definitely not a budget deck by any means either. So, quite a bit of expensive cards. Plus, people tend to like to either beta it out or foil it out. And, there's people, that archetype has a lot of big fans.
Yeah, those of us who are purveyors of fancy cardboard have our own set of problems outside of card accessibility.
Totally.
I really like the perspective of thinking about Ancient Tomb and White Plume as cards that are sort of quintessential to the monocolor or to the two-color experience, because one of the fears, existential fears that I have is that the format just becomes four-color soup, and that there's no because mana ends up being free, because we just, as an eternal format, we just get, they just add triomes sometimes to the format, and all of a sudden mana that was slightly challenging is now trivial. And so the idea of trying to avoid pointing cards that support monocolor and two-color strategies, even if they see some amount of play in other 3 and 4 and 5 color decks, not pointing them with those decks in mind is, I think, a really wise and a frame that I hadn't really considered when I thought about Ancient Tomb. Because when I look at a card like Ancient Tomb, or even like an Urza Saga, right, which does see D&T play and get some play in Cruel Monsters, I see them all from the perspective of what I do with them in an Academy deck, in an Artifact deck, where that two colorless mana pays off to a combo strategy as opposed to a fair one. But the fact that the Ancient Tomb is so strong in the fair strategy sort of means that you want to attack those combo decks, or at least my combo deck, in a different axis. You don't want to mess with the Ancient Tomb because of the impact on the rest of the format and the impact on the decks that really do need it to remain viable and remain at the level that they're at. And it's not like D&T is really pushing other decks out of the format. It doesn't need to be hit with a pointing. I think that's a really valuable thing to be aware of.
Totally. And also, in terms of format philosophy, I always try not to look at, this card, we always try and look at the card played at its best, and the strongest archetype should be the format for this. This is one of the few times I feel like I personally break that rule a little bit, where I'm okay, these colorless lands really enable these two-colored decks, which I think are important for format diversity and for the format in general. And in terms of numbers, Gruul, D&T, and Red put up very good numbers. They're definitely all viable archetypes, definitely all in that top couple tiers for sure. So they're definitely viable. I always have the fear that the format might become a 4-color, 5-color pile soup. That hasn't happened yet. I actually don't think that it necessarily will. I think that many players thought that the printing of triomes would make that. I definitely made the 4-color decks and 4-color control combo decks incredibly more viable and smooth. However, I do think that a lot of these other decks do punish them, and I think players forget that colorless is essentially adding another color. And I don't mean wastes, but if you're adding Saga, Waste, and or Strip, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, potentially Crystal Vein or other colorless lands, you've added a bevy of lands that do not produce color pips. You cannot be playing a 4-color deck and have 5 colorless lands in it. I mean, you can, but you're going to stumble. And if you're playing a lot of triomes as well, your fundamental turn is not low anymore, right? And you can look to other,
it slows
other
down
formats.
Measurably.
Totally, you have perfect mana. You can play turns 3 to 5 with immensely powerful cards, and the dog's breakfast of choice for whatever you want to do with it. But people can get in from underneath you, and people that are casting a Turn 1 Ragavan or a Turn 1 White Plume Adventure are going to get you, or be able to attack your mana at least.
You are going to get got by those cards. There's one more card that I want to chat about before we move towards some forward thinking thoughts here, and that card is the dog, Comet, as we all know and love him. One of the things that I have on my radar with Comet is that new player experience that you were talking about, where the card doesn't necessarily feel fun to play against due to its variance. What's your take on Comet?
I hate Comet. I absolutely detest this card exists. I hate it in so many ways. This is probably the most off my normal form I'll go on a card, but yeah, I do not like Comet. Comet does not like me. Every time I play Comet, I never seems to perform, and then every time I face against it, they roll 6 into 6. So I don't mind variance in games, but Comet is just terrible. It's a terrible card design. I hate this card. A lot of people really like it. It's powerful. I think it fits similar to it's definitely not as powerful and consistent as Minsc and Boo. It's definitely a powerful card. I would say it's very low on my list of cards to point to one. For myself, I don't think it's ever been brought up in a discussion at present. So it's NPE through the roof. I hate that card. New player, negative player experience, poor. I mean, I wish that we never printed it. That and Attractions, I think, are some of the cards that we've much maligned that we wish we could just kind of ban from the format to some extent, but would go against kind of like the format philosophy.
Yeah, that's fair.
And
That's fair.
yeah, and to people that hate Comet, I'm there with you. Just hope they don't. That's a card that it involves the dice, which is always painful in this game. Similar to back in the day when you used to be Hymn to Toract, and you used to always roll perfect dice, and always felt like the variance is pretty crazy on those. So
Yeah, or gamble. People who are out here playing gamble, like, got some balls.
now we're talking. Yeah.
Yeah, I played a game with Comet, and I cast a Comet, picked up a Time Walk, cast the Time Walk, rolled for Comet, made some squirrels, picked up the Time Walk, cast the Time Walk. My opponent just scooped. It's like, yeah, that doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel like a particularly fun thing. Just happened to roll really well on Comet, like. But also, you're right in that it's not really that powerful. It's just obnoxious, and it's not powerful and obnoxious enough simultaneously to warrant getting pushed towards the point discussion. Even, it has to be just a little bit more miserable before we can start doing something like that.
Yeah, and I'm sure every player has multiple cards they find miserable. Mono red players back in the day used to detest Core Firewalker, Sanctifier, and Vex. So I'm sure if you're a mono red player, those cards are also miserable to play against. And every Storm player obviously hates Endurance existing. So
let's start pivoting. There's a couple more things I want to pick your brain on. I know we're coming up on an hour and a half here, which is we budgeted for 45 to 90 minutes. We've hit the end of that, but I've got so much more I want to talk about.
All right.
So I'll try to keep it concise. But one of the things that people were asking about that I really sort of wanted to get your perspective on, where do you think people should be spending their time to build the format? I've started doing some of these videos. We now have this Winners Archive. We have the Calendar Decklist database. There's lots of resources that people are now starting to build, and more content that's coming out. What are the ways that you think the community could be best served by people who want to get involved or get engaged with Canadian Highlander and to start creating or building resources or tools or frameworks or ideas to share with the community?
Well, that's a really excellent question. Obviously, all content is good. I've noticed, like, obviously yourself creating these videos. I watched your Time Vault video on YouTube. That was really informative, and I quite enjoyed it. Anyone that produces any sort of content is really good for the community. People, and I think that all the content creators in the community need to be cognizant that, like, even if it only has like a few views or like 20, 30 views, or like if it's up to like a few hundred views, like that's really awesome. Like that's a large chunk of the community, right? So it's really important that happens, and then that it only like dovetails larger with time. So the more content people create and are consistent with it, and I think that's important, consistency. A lot of people start podcasts and they do like 5 or 6 episodes and they don't meet like a threshold that they feel that they need to. But you'll notice that lots of the ones that have kept going over the years have had a lot of success and a lot of followers. And if you affect the mind frame of a few people in your local community, or the broader community, and want to discuss like decks and stuff like that, then I think that's really positive, really good. Something that I think for 2024 myself, I'm trying to look towards kind of creating a few exciting tournament opportunities for people to be able to kind of come from other metas. I find the competitive tournaments seem to be very exciting for myself, and I like to travel to them and have in the past. So I'm going to be trying to move towards that. I'm also currently in a TO chat with a bunch of people from Discord that I haven't mentioned too much, but I'd really like to be talking with other TOs, and both to inform me as a counselor and also to develop more kind of year-end top 8s or invitationals, and just generally having more of local tournament scenes, be able to post results enables us to look at each other's decks, which I think all of us at the end of the day that like this format are deck builders to some extent, and also to like be able to extrapolate some data from that, which is important for us as the council. I think more content, more tournaments, more discussions, and I think just kind of communicating with who's the movers and shakers in different areas. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to be like the most outgoing or popular or like whatever person in an area, but someone that collects a lot of data in an area can be like a useful representative for like a zone, right? Right now we're kind of coming out of like the dark ages again, it seems like, with like different people from different metas. So it's exciting to see like people being like, oh, I'm the TO from this region, or I'm the person that TOs these series online, or oh, I'm trying to put together a tournament for this region. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I find tournaments are a particularly a thing that is very close to my heart personally. I was instrumental in the CDH tournament scene for a number of years. During COVID, I set a couple records for online tournament attendance, and sort of driving and I, I I find tournaments to sort of be the culmination of a format as a primarily competitive player. Getting to see people put everything on the line and say, when I put my money on the table, we're here to see who's the best player and who's the best brew and who's really bringing their A game. I really find a lot of value in tournaments, and it's a very meaningful thing to me. And one of the components that was very important for CEDH as a part of the culture was sort of proxies, and the fact that most players have to purchase 6 or 8, or I guess 3, 6, or 10 dual lands for their decks. And the financial burden of CDH is pretty sizable, since there are so many reserve list cards you can shove into a deck all at once. Lion's Eye Diamonds, Intuitions, Grim Monoliths, Mana Crypts, which racks up thousands of dollars in costs pretty quickly. Do you think that proxy acceptance is something that the council should speak on, if it's something that's important to the council? Do you personally think that that's something that the community should be looking to adopt, or do you think that that's something that's not as important as other aspects of tournament play?
The council in general has just tried to focus on more of like direction of format and pointing. So we've tried to stick away from TO behavior. And locally in our meta, we decided upon CE quite some time ago, following kind of German ladder in that way, I believe. And then recently we've kind of moved towards acceptance of proxies in our local. We've seen many other locals do that, and I think that as a format as a whole, that proxies are good for the format. At the end of the day, more players playing the format's good. If putting some limit to proxies, I think is important. We want like the local stores to want to host the event and to want to get these cards and buy them. And I think that maybe like a 5 to 10 proxy limit makes it so that those pieces of power that most people would have a lot of difficulty acquiring, or even just going like we only allow CE. That makes it so that power can be far more financially attainable for some people. These are all really important, and at the end of the day, most Magic players, I'd say, even if they have a proxy for a card, are searching for that card or willing to trade or buy for it at some point. It's just mostly a card availability. And I know for myself, even like and I'm obviously like I'm quite an enfranchised Magic player, having played a long time, played a lot of tournament formats. I have like most of the duels, and most I at one point or another have had power. But lately there's a lot of cards where there's an obscure common from some old set that I want to play in some pet deck, and I end up having to proxy it because I just can't find it. You can't find it in person, you can't find it online, but I'm like constantly searching for this, deck for my pet martyr proc deck or something like that, and I want to play it at a tournament, so use those slots. So I think it's important people have access to that as well. And then for people that maybe don't have access to like an underground scene or a recall but want to play those decks, I think that's really important too. And when you shuffle those cards and see them laid on the table, like, it's a beautiful game. We all like the art, we like the aesthetics of it for various reasons, and I think most players will try and hunt those cards out so they can sling the cardboard.
Yeah, I think for most players, proxies are almost always aspirational. If they could afford it, they would choose to buy it. It's just they end up being priced out of it for the fact that cards are kind of ridiculous these days. And I say that as somebody who, I own all the duels. I've spent thousands upon thousands of dollars on this game, and that's just not something a lot of players have the ability or even necessarily the desire to do, when those thousands of dollars also represent other life experiences or vacations or time off or a car or a house. So there's definitely that sort of dueling nature where it's like, I would love to spend $2,000 on a Mox Sapphire if, for starters, I could find one for $2,000 and I had $2,000 lying around to spare.
Mm-hmm.
But until then, I'll proxy Mox Sapphire if I have to.
In the last few large 30 to 50 plus tournaments that were allowed non-proxies, I thought that it would affect the local meta, but I've actually been surprised by the people that have power. So it hasn't actually affected the meta choices of those tournaments as much as I thought it would, which is actually awesome. It means people are able to play with these cards in their collection that they haven't been able to play with for a long time. and I think that drives like interest for LGSs and stores to like carry these eternal products, which is important. I think it's important for TOs and LGSs that are engaging in sales of cards, etc., to also know that if a person if you enable a person to play the format with 10 proxies and it gets them into the format, they're still going to buy in for like quite a lot of money. Like it's not a cheap format, even if you are proxying duels plus power. A lot of the cards are the chase cards of all of Eternal for all Magic's history.
Right. I mean, if you look at just taking D&T as an example, Ancient Tomb's $80.
100%. Exactly. So, don't be afraid of allowing proxies, I guess. And I fully support it myself personally. And I think it's important to the format. And I think it's important to the growth of the format as a whole.
Yeah, I know the MXP series for 2024, I think, is going to be no proxy, which is disappointing, but also I understand why they choose to do it that way. I think it's also, it is one of the things that one of the few things I do like about no proxy tournaments is that thing you mentioned where it's like, there's all this sort of like, oh, do you have this card? Well, I'm not using it for this event. Like, I can loan it to you. And there's a little part of me that enjoys the sort of like behind the scenes of scrambling to find these cards. And one of my buddies is a very enfranchised player. He has I borrowed his Twister, his Workshop, and his Candelabra when I went to MXP Tacoma to play Paradox Academy earlier this year. And I'm very privileged that to start I owned all the rest of the cards I needed. And that I have a friend who has those 3 cards and trusts me enough to loan them to me. But that's one of the things I do like is this sort of like, oh yeah, I'm not using my Taiga for this event, I'm not playing it. Oh yeah, here you go, Gruul Monster's friend, please borrow my Taiga. That part of the community I do have. There's a little part of me that likes it as well, even though I generally am pro proxy as well.
Yeah, and I also quite enjoy that too, and it forces people to interact a bit more. I always find it funny that there's people that these are your friends and community members that like we enjoy playing these games with, but it's like essentially you're like, hey, do you mind if I borrow $2,000 to $5,000 off you for like 1 week? And then people are like, oh yeah, no problem. And like it's just pretty wild. But if most of your good friends, if you're like, hey, can I borrow like $2,000 to $5,000? And they'd be like, what? But in this community, particularly in Eternal, I think people are just willing to do that. I think of a person in the format, Jerry White, he doesn't play anymore, but used to have quite an extensive collection and would regularly lend out entire Highlander decks to new players with like very little personal interaction with them, which I always thought was like very like magnanimous of that person, and like definitely helped get a lot of people into the format at the time. And I think the more interaction you have with that, where people are like, hey, you want to borrow this cradle, or you want to borrow this candle, ancient team, etc., I think that's a good form of building. Also creates like a trust rapport with people, because at the end of the day, this is a game of humans playing other humans, and I think it's important that we don't always lose sight of that, particularly even in the competitive scene. A lot of us can get kind of like trapped into like trying to get that win or trying to like score those edges or angles, but it's important to know that like it's the human element. We're all here to have a good time, and I generally find that a lot of the matches of Canadian Highlander I play against are quite enjoyable, and the people are very enjoyable to play against. And I think it's important that we're all like, remember that at any given time, we're all ambassadors to the format. We're always trying to get more people into this. We're not trying to scare them away or trying to gatekeep.
I agree. Well, I've got two final questions for you. Closing thoughts. What are the concerns that you and the council have for the future? Looking at 2024, are there anything that stand out as concerns that you guys have?
As a general whole, we're a little bit concerned about where Moxen's on the list. I think I mentioned that before. And we are waiting till post Modern Horizons 3 to like have this discussion in person. I have some personal concerns about just attendance / interactions of certain council members, but that's a whole other discussion. And myself included, I took a break from the council when I wasn't playing regularly. So I think that's important for people to address. The makeup of the council is something that I wonder about myself personally sometimes. As discussed earlier, talking about different regions having access to that, something that I was passionate about back in the 2015 to 2018 era. I think one of my concerns also for the format is that we kind of lose kind of cohesion on what it is. Recently there's like that big 2018 lander I saw on Discord. There's people that are just like, well, I'm just going to play like 14-point lander or just play German lander or Aussie lander or stuff like that. And it's just like I feel like as we spill out to these like subgroups, the format loses cohesion, popularity, and accessibility, and then seems more casual, or make up your own rules. And although people play your cards however you want, but as a format, that's always something I think when you lose the cohesion of it, it loses some of its specialness. And I think that also like removes some of the elements of the community of it. Yeah, and then I think that also plays a bit of like my own personal and perhaps that of some other members of the council, just like fear of like kind of like losing control over our own format. That's principally been the reason we haven't expanded historically the council to other regions, is just and why we removed like a lot of the voting systems. Is there's been times when people have essentially made a run of the council on a popular point and then made the council really difficult to work with. Right now the council, everyone that's on it knows each other quite well, or has historically known each other quite well, both within the tournament scene and like most of us have met in real life. And we are all good communicators on the council and all have a lot of respect for each other as human beings, and that's really important. And that generally has been the case, but has not always been the case. And my fear would be that there's a council where there's multiple members that don't either respect each other or see eye to eye. And right now that's not the case, but that's always a fear going forward. But right now I'd say like the council's in a fairly good place and the format's in a good place, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Well, final question for you. What are your hopes? What do you want to see in 2024? If we get to the end, if we sit down next year this time and have a chat about how 2024 went, what are the things that you'd love to see the most over the next 365 days?
Well, I'd be very stoked if you're continuing this podcast and invite me back for next year recap. I think that'll mean we're both in a good place magic-wise. Comet to 1. No, I'm just kidding.
That dog, though. That dog.
That goddamn dog. I think I would really like to see some of the bug bant no pro kind of no Atraxa strategies develop. It'd be fun to see lands kind of redevelop. I get excited when I see an old archetype get a bunch of playables and then people start playing it and become excited about that archetype. So I'd really like to see that. This ties into a little bit of fear right now with our recent kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off a bunch of pointings, which is like, do not want to see combo become the dominant archetype again. I always appreciate when combo can win a tournament or spike a tournament, particularly if the meta is not adapting to it, and that's fine. But what I do not want to see is every tournament, particularly every competitive large tournament, dominated by 50+% combo players. So I'm hoping that does not happen. So my hope for the format is that we have a diverse format of a variety of mid-range, including non-blue mid-range decks, and combo control, etc. And I hope to see some new archetypes this year and people brewing and getting along with each other and a cool tournament circuit. I think it'd be fun to see more TOs kind of like aim higher for the tournament.
Awesome. Well, I think that's everything that I have for you as we come to the end of our lengthy discussion. Do you have anything else you want to add? Anything you want to plug? Any closing thoughts before we sign off for the day?
No, just thanks for having me on. Feel free to message me at Death Rich on the Discord. I'm Spencer Kanaka Sackland on Twitter, etc. Feel free to reach out with any comments, questions, concerns. Like, comment, subscribe. As you can
ring the notification bell so that you get notified.
Ring that notification bell. And as you know, I'm pretty, and much like the best of you lately, I'm pretty open to having any sort of DM discussion about cards, pointings, musings, whinges, whines, etc. And I know many of the other counselors are too, so feel free to hit them up as well.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Send Spencer all the Comet memes you can find.
Just more memes about Jitte. It's great.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Spencer. I really appreciated the chance to sit down and have this chat. For everyone who is listening, thank you so much for sitting through this lengthy discussion. And, of course, as always, feel free to start a dialogue in the comments on the Discord. You can always shoot me a message. And thank you so much for watching.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.